going, guys? Today on the show, I want to talk about the future of where Dodge is heading. Right now, when people in the YouTube community are discussing the next 3 to 5 years for Dodge, it's a lot of doom and gloom right now, and understandably so. Performance enthusiasts have been seriously on board with Dodge's stuff a Hellcat and everything program since the 6.2 liter engine came out in 2015 when Dodge introduced the Hellcat. 0 to 60 and quarter mile times are the lowest they've ever been, ever. I mean, realistically, this is the golden era of muscle cars that is now coming to an end. It has been an amazing time to be a Mopar enthusiast. But the Challenger and Charger platform are soon coming to an end. As of right now, and I guess by the time the end of the run comes up, they've been going on for about 15 years, which is an eternity for a vehicle production run. I mean, it realistically is time for a change. Now, unfortunately, times are changing as well. It's not 2008 anymore. We are at kind of a crossroads right now, which is a little bit bittersweet. With technology pushing performance further and further and reducing emissions more and more, or just completely eliminating them altogether, which, don't get me wrong, is a great thing. But we also love the V8. We love our Hemis and we love muscle cars, which kind of puts us in a little bit of a weird spot. I mean, we obviously don't want to see the V8 die, but at the same time, with the unreal performance of EVs and the prospect of zero emissions going forward, it seems like it's the obvious next step.
Better, faster Dodges. Because Dodge doesn't view EV technology as a revolution, but instead as a natural evolution of the modern muscle car.
The entire automotive industry is in a transition point right now, which means the future is kind of uncertain. Things are absolutely changing, but we don't exactly know what's coming down the pipe, which makes people a little bit uneasy. Understandable. In this episode, I wanted to talk about where Dodge is going to be in the next 5 years and what the performance landscape is going to look like at that time. So to tackle this topic, I figure it only makes sense to look at the past and see what we can apply to present day. Now, of course, I'm talking about the original muscle car era and how it began to fizzle out and die just when it was arguably at its peak and what caused that decline. Plus, honestly, I just really love talking about classic muscle cars anyway. So let's dive in. Now, there is a ton of debate on when exactly the muscle car era started and what cars started it, but I don't really want to tackle that in this video. For the sake of argument, we'll just say that by the mid-60s, all domestic car manufacturers had caught on that the young market were really looking for performance cars and not just a piece of transportation that was going to get you from A to B. They were looking for performance. Now, understanding these changes in the market, every single domestic auto manufacturer jumped in with their own performance vehicle. Even brands that didn't have anything for performance like Oldsmobile and Buick, definitely not what you'd normally think of for performance cars, they both came out with amazing muscle cars in this era. Everybody was on board. It was like a movement, and everybody was all in on it.
This is the new Dodge Challenger RT.
Wouldn't it be nice if you had a 442?
Camaro, fiery new creation from Chevrolet.
What is it about Mustang that makes it happen? Maybe it's the new styling for 68.
For a road machine that really flies, get a Firebird.
There's just no resisting it. 1969 Dodge Charger.
Now, I would argue that 1970 was kind of the absolute peak of this wave. It's when Dodge came out with the Challenger as kind of a smaller counterpart to the Charger, which had been out for a number of years, and the Barracuda, the Plymouth Barracuda. Horsepower was crazy. They had the 426 Hemi, the legendary 426 Hemi, which is the reason why every single one of all of Dodge's V8s currently are Hemi V8s.
Hey, that thing got a Hemi?
Yeah. Absolutely legendary engine. The 440, which to be honest, I would probably almost rather have than the 426 Hemi for a classic Mopar. That 440 just absolutely ripped, especially down low. Ford had their 429 Boss Mustang. Plymouth had outfitted the Barracuda with a Hemi, making a Hemi Cuda version of it. The Camaro came out with the Z28. Firebirds came out with the Trans Am, the Pontiac Firebird Trans Am. Everybody was on board, and horsepower was at its absolute peak. Performance at this point was the best it had ever been. Now, doesn't that kind of sound familiar to what's happening today? 797, 800 horsepower, absolute monsters that you can buy from the factory. Performance that we've never ever seen the likes of up until this point, right at the peak. Those two things are definitely parallel. We're kind of at the exact same spot. Then almost immediately after it hit that peak in 1970, the muscle car era very quickly started to die off. Now, if we can look at the circumstances around that, we can probably find a few more parallels that maybe we can kind of compare to today. So one thing to remember is in 1970, the Clean Air Act came to pass, and GM was one of the first manufacturers to sign on to it. So in 1971, GM cut all the compression on all their motors from 10 or 11 to 1 down to about 8.75 to 1.
Shall we make our peace with nature and begin to make reparations for the damage we have done to our air, to our land, and to our water?
They took the lead out of gasoline, started making unleaded gasoline, lower quantities of lead in all the gasoline to help with emissions. And the catch was lower lead gasolines did not run great in those high compression engines. So they cut compression on all their engines across the board. GM was the first one to do it. Now this had a massive effect on horsepower. For example, the 350 that was in the Camaro from GM went from 360 horsepower in 1970 down to 255 horsepower in 1971. A drastic drop, 105 horsepower, just boom, 1 year after another. Now both Ford and Chrysler followed suit in 1972, which had similar effects. Horsepower drastically dropped. 1971, they dropped the 426 and the 440, which was one huge nail in the coffin for muscle cars. The 340 was one of the best motors you could get from then forward, but even still, their highest output was like just a shadow of what it was in 1970 with the 426 or the 440. Even with the 340 itself was down a significant amount from 1970 compared to 1972. So another significant factor in this time period was insurance rates began to absolutely skyrocket for high performance cars. All of a sudden you had insurance premiums that rivaled the car payment, and it quickly made it a not so attractive option to jump into a 426 Hemi when it was a really expensive car at the time, and then you double the cost of that payment with a super high insurance premium. It definitely scared a lot of buyers away. And finally, the last thing that kind of really put the nail in the coffin of the original muscle car era was the 1973 oil embargo. Now, this led to gas shortages all over America, where suddenly people were lined up for miles waiting to get gas for their cars. They couldn't get to work. They couldn't go out and get groceries. They had vehicles that they literally couldn't use because there was no gas to be had.
People can no longer afford to run cars that do 12 miles to the gallon. Petrol stations can no longer afford to fill up cars whose tanks take 20 gallons. The monsters are dying of thirst. The energy crisis is killing them.
Gas stations were rationing out gas, so you couldn't take a bunch of jerry cans and buy a ton. It was a crazy situation where people could not get to work, and it was kind of a wake-up call for most Americans, and Canadians for that matter, that kind of made them realize that maybe 6 miles per gallon wasn't the best route forward when suddenly gas prices doubled, like almost immediately.
How many miles to the gallon does it do?
This car will get somewhere between 6 to 8 miles per gallon.
Suddenly 6 miles per gallon wasn't too appealing anymore. And the demand combined with the insurance rates, combined with the Emissions Act, really put the nail in the coffin of the original muscle car. Most muscle cars like the Challenger had stopped production by 1974, and at that point they were literally just a shadow of their former selves. For what started out as such an amazing badass car, all of a sudden just kind of went quietly off in 1974, which was kind of sad, to be honest. Now, at the very tail end of this era, so like the late 70s, there was really only 3 holdouts from that original muscle car era. It was the Mustang, the Firebird, Firebird Trans Am, and the Chevy Camaro. Now, those 3 were just shadows of their former selves. Most of them could barely even break the 15-second mark in the quarter mile, which is pathetic. You got 16-second cars, which are the top offerings they had. I have a 1981 Trans Am, which is the last of that second generation, same Smokey and the Bandit style. It has a 5-liter V8 making 145 horsepower from the factory. It's pathetic. 4 bangers today just blow it out of the water. And the gas mileage is still quite terrible out of that motor. So it was a really kind of sad end to the muscle car era. Even though those 3 did stick around, performance was nowhere to be found from these manufacturers. It was more sold on looks and handling packages and graphics packages, more of like a cool factor than a performance factor. Performance was nowhere to be found at this point. Now, it took from the end of the 70s until the 90s before we even saw a domestic V8 break 300 horsepower again, which is really, really sad. That is a huge block of time. I remember seeing an article from Motor Trend in, I think it was like 1986. It was an old issue that I found where they were unbelievably excited because that year's Trans Am finally had enough power to make the tires kind of squeal a little bit. And it was really, really a sad time. Like when you're super excited that it just barely has enough power to kind of spin the tires a little bit on launch. It's kind of, we take the performance we have today for granted. I know that much. I mean, the base models in every single muscle car from the big 3 today all put out better performance than that, and none of them are V8s. It was a super dark era. The only reasonable performance car that Dodge put out in this era, and I'm not talking about the Viper because that was a halo car that very few people could afford, was the Dodge Stealth, which was a rebadged Mitsubishi 3000 GT. And they discontinued that in 1996. Don't get me wrong, they were super cool cars, but it wasn't even really a Dodge. Like it kind of was, but basically it was a reskinned Mitsubishi. Dodge had no performance to speak of for decades. So growing up in high school, I honestly didn't really think much of Dodge as a performance brand. I mean, there's the muscle cars of the 70s that were all super cool, but when you don't put out a performance car for 30 years, it's easy to overlook you as a performance brand. The crazy thing is Dodge didn't even have a performance car in their lineup until at least 2003 when they came out with the SRT4. Now, don't get me wrong, the SRT4s were super cool, but if you weren't into sport compacts at the time, you'd have to wait until at least 2006 when they finally came out with a Charger. Although it was a sedan, at least you could get it with a Hemi at that point. And then finally in 2008 when they re-released the Challenger, you could kind of see some performance vehicles start to trickle into Dodge. It was then when I bought my car in 2009 when I kind of looked at it and realized Dodge is coming back around and I like where things are headed. But man, it took an eternity before we even got anything, any sniff of performance from Dodge. It was a super, super sad era. Now, the thing that gives me hope is that the performance EVs that they're coming out with are nowhere near as terrible as what we got for 30 years after the end of the last muscle car era. That gives me hope. Performance from new EVs is unbelievable, actually. The torque they put out reminds me a lot of big block V8s. It's immediate torque and just extreme throw you back in your seat torque, which is exciting. It makes for exciting drives. The thing that's kind of weird about it is there's no sound, there's no theater, the sensory part of it is really quiet, which is definitely strange. There's definitely trade-offs here. Now, although I absolutely know that it is not the same theater as a snarling, roaring Hemi, I would gladly take an EV, a performance EV, over a 2.6 liter pile of garbage that came in the 78 to 84 second generation Challenger that was really a rebadged Mitsubishi. They were absolute garbage, and thank God we're not going back to that era, because if that was our choice of the only way that we could keep an internal combustion engine, I don't want it. Now, don't get me wrong, hear me out here. I am definitely not saying that we should be excited about the prospect of not having a Hemi in the upcoming Dodge lineup 5 years from now. I feel extremely conflicted about that, and I'm sure most of you guys feel the same way. But personally, I'm not ready to go all doom and gloom on the future of Dodge and write everything off without at least keeping an open mind for these performance EVs. I mean, until you've really gotten in the seat of one and had some seat time with them, I'm not going to throw a ton of judgment down. I know better than that. I don't like change like the rest of everybody, but at the same point, I really want to keep an open mind about what's coming, because Dodge has the right attitude right now. They understand their customer base and what has made them great and what's kind of brought them from the brink of bankruptcy in 2008 and kind of got them back on track. So being that they know their market, I don't think the future is going to be as bad as some people are making it out to seem. I do find it really hard to just crap all over EVs without weighing the pros and cons and experiencing an EV, especially with the quarter mile numbers that those cars are putting up. Gotta try to be positive, gotta keep an open mind. Things aren't nearly gonna be as bad as they were when I was coming out of high school, we'll say that. So anyways, guys, until next time, cheers.